Arrogant cops thought they were above the law, until a slap landed on the wrong son. The badge hidden beneath that calm belonged to the new deputy sheriff, Big Shaq's son. In front of cameras, children, and silence, they triggered a reckoning Oakside couldn't contain. This wasn't a mistake. It was a warning. Because in this town, the badge doesn't blink, and Big Shaq doesn't forget. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. Oakside was the kind of place realtors called aspirational. Pristine sidewalks, hedges trimmed with surgeon precision, and a silence that almost dared you to raise your voice. Every house looked airbrushed into place, driveways gleamed, porch lights glowed at exactly the same hour, and American flags rippled in synchronized pride. The HOA was as much a government as the city itself, issuing newsletters, regulating lawn decor, and ensuring everything and everyone stayed comfortably familiar. Into this curated symmetry moved Shaquille O'Neal, known to most as Big Shaq, but now simply a man, looking for peace. Retirement wasn't new to him. He'd been retired from basketball for years. But this was different. He wasn't seeking stillness. He was seeking safety, and not just for himself, but for his son. Miles O'Neal, 24, sharp-eyed and quietly thoughtful, was no ordinary young man. He had recently passed his deputy sheriff training under a statewide initiative to diversify rural law enforcement. His badge was fresh, but his discipline wasn't. Calm, methodical, and deeply aware of what the badge meant and didn't mean. Miles walked with the quiet strength of someone who knew the ground beneath him could shift any second. They moved into Oakside in late August, right before school began, during the golden hour of suburbia. Movers arrived with precision, packages neatly stacked, boxes labeled with care, and yet, from the moment the O'Neal family's name appeared on the neighborhood directory, the shift began. It wasn't loud. No one threw rocks or posted signs. Oakside didn't operate in open rejection. It preferred suggestion. The first HOA email Shaq received included a reminder about basketball hoops being discouraged. No violation, just a tone. The first welcome visit from a neighbor ended in a comment about how rare it is to see new faces around here. Real new ID. At the grocery store, a clerk paused long before asking Miles for ID, as if confirming he belonged in line with everyone else. Miles, dressed in plain jeans and a tucked-in polo, had gone unnoticed until the town realized the SUV in the driveway wasn't a visitor's. It was his, and the quiet presence he brought with him every day began to turn heads. Not because he was loud, but because he wasn't. One morning, Miles stood outside the local middle school as traffic bottlenecked at the drop-off loop. It wasn't his post, but he wasn't on duty, just helping clear confusion where crossing guards were absent. His stance was relaxed but attentive, his badge visible on a lanyard tucked under his jacket. Then came the sheriff's cruisers. A squad car crept up, lights off but presence loud. 2 officers stepped out. Miles recognized them from precinct orientation weeks prior. Deputy Travis Rowe, silver-templed, always gritting his jaw, and Deputy Barrett Clay, younger, with eyes that scanned like they expected guilt. They didn't approach with curiosity. They approached with presumption. "You authorized to be here?" Clay asked, his hand resting near his hip. Miles calmly nodded, pulling out his credentials, extending them like a peace offering that should have been unnecessary. But they didn't look at the badge. Not really. Their eyes had already made a decision. Rowe took a step closer, looked past the ID and into Miles's face, with narrowed suspicion. "We've had calls about loitering. Some parents concerned about safety." His tone was flat, but the insinuation clung like smoke. "Unassisting with drop-off until the school gets its volunteers sorted," Miles replied evenly. "Traffic control." "You been assigned?" Clay asked. "No. Just helping." "Then you're not needed." Rowe's voice was sharp this time. "We'll take it from here." It wasn't what they said. It was how they said it, and how close they stood. How the second cruiser pulled behind Miles's car just minutes later. How they lingered, watching, waiting for something to escalate, that never would. Miles stepped aside. He didn't argue, he didn't react. He walked to his SUV, slid into the seat, and pulled away in silence. Behind him, one of the officers smirked. A teacher at the gate had watched the whole thing. She wouldn't speak up. Not yet, but she wouldn't forget. When he returned home that evening, Shaq was in the backyard, tending to a grill that hadn't yet seen a neighbor's visit. Miles didn't say much. He just recounted the exchange in clipped sentences. Shaq listened without interrupting, without looking away from the flames licking the iron. When Miles finished, Shaq nodded once and flipped the rack of ribs. "You okay?" he asked. "I'm fine." Shaq didn't press. But inside, something repositioned. This wasn't the first time he'd seen the shape racism took when it wore manners. He'd faced it on courts, in negotiations, behind boardroom curtains. But Oakside had dressed it up in landscaping guidelines and neighborhood safety lingo. It wore khakis and carried clipboards, and now it was staring at his son like the badge on his chest had an expiration date tied to his skin. Over the next week, things became more specific. A utility check coincidentally cut power to their home during a heat wave. The garbage truck skipped their driveway. Mail arrived late, or not at all. All excuses came with apologies. Never anger. Oakside didn't shout. It iced. And then came the incident. It was a new week, a new school morning. Traffic again. Sluggish. Miles again stepping in. Because no one else would. This time he wore his uniform. Khaki shirt, crisp badge pinned to the collar, body cam blinking blue. Parents waved at him from behind windshields. One woman rolled her window down to say thank you. Kids smiled. A little girl handed him a coffee. Her mom had bought him. But across the street, a dark blue SUV rolled to a stop. Same two officers. No sirens. Just eyes. Miles turned slightly toward them. Not in challenge but recognition. Clay stepped out. Rowe followed. They didn't speak. Just stood. Watched. For too long. And when Miles walked back to his vehicle, there was a parking citation on his windshield. Improper use of patrol position. No such infraction existed in department policy. Miles took a photo of it, then drove off. Quietly. He didn't tear it up. He didn't rant online. He didn't bring it to the chief. Not yet. Instead, he walked into his home, placed the slip on the kitchen counter, and began typing an internal memo. Title: Pattern of Undermining Authority. Field Notes. Oakside Division. Shaq stood in the doorway, watching him. He didn't ask what happened. The note said enough. What Oakside didn't understand, what it never counted on, was that silence could go both ways. They had built a town on keeping things quiet. But Shaq had mastered silence as a weapon, and Miles had inherited it. This wasn't the kind of fight you won with shouting. This was a war fought in posture, in pattern, and in knowing when to let the cameras do the talking. Each morning, just after 6:30 a.m., Miles took to the sidewalks in full sheriff deputy attire. Not for ceremony, not for show. His badge caught the light when the sun peeked over the treetops, but he didn't flash it. He simply walked. Past houses that still had dew on their driveways. Past mailboxes that seemed to lean away from him. He didn't wave first, but he never ignored a greeting. When someone looked him in the eye, he met it. When someone didn't, he didn't push. His walk wasn't a patrol. It was a message, one not everyone was ready to receive. The neighborhood began to notice. Not the kind of notice that ended in applause. Whispers moved faster than the morning joggers. First it was curiosity. That Shaquille O'Neal's boy. Then it became suspicion. Did he really go through training? Is he even certified? Probably one of those diversity placements. No one asked him directly. Oakside didn't work that way. It floated rumors like kites and waited to see who'd grab the string. But Miles didn't grab anything. He just kept walking. Reed Stenson had been with the Oakside PD for over 2 decades. Barrel-chested with a walk that dared you to flinch, he spoke like every word was part of an order, even when it wasn't. Kyle Maddox, a decade younger and far more volatile, followed Stenson like a shadow that hadn't learned independence yet. Both had watched the department change. They didn't like it. To them, the badge meant authority backed by legacy. Not change, not reform, and certainly not someone like Miles. The first wellness check happened outside the community library. Miles was parked, reading case notes on his tablet when the cruiser rolled up beside him. Stenson stepped out, hands on hips. "Morning," he said, voice clipped. "Deputy," Miles replied, not rising to the bait. "You assigned to this beat?" "Just reviewing files." "Not on patrol." Maddox leaned forward in the passenger seat. "We've had some calls about suspicious unmarked units near public buildings. Just doing our job." Miles didn't look away. "You saw the plate. You know who this is registered to." "That's not the point," Stenson cut in. "Point is, when people don't recognize the car, they start asking questions. And when they don't recognize the face, they ask even more." There it was. Politeness pulled tight over prejudice. Miles nodded once. Copy that. I'll finish up and relocate. Stenson didn't move. Neither did Maddox. They stood there for another 10 seconds. The kind of delay that wasn't accidental. Then, finally, the cruiser pulled away. No citation. No real reason. Just presence, to remind him of theirs. By the end of the week, Miles had logged 4 such encounters. Always brief. Always hollow. Always meant to check something that didn't need checking. Then came the memo. It wasn't on police letterhead. It was HOA stamped. Circulated through neighborhood inboxes, under the subject line, Security Advisory, Uniformed Personnel Protocol. The language was carefully sanitized. Concerns have been raised about unscheduled law enforcement presence in common areas. Residents are advised to report any individuals who appear to be impersonating official personnel. No names, no specifics, but everyone knew who they were talking about. Shaq read it over coffee, holding the page like it was too fragile to crumple but too offensive not to. This is them pretending they don't see what they're doing, he said, handing it to Miles. Miles scanned it, folded it, filed it. They're not trying to stop me. They're trying to scare me. He still walked the next morning. Same path. Same uniform. But now, garage doors closed a little faster when he passed. Some parents crossed the street with their kids without looking back. Others gave half smiles that trembled in the corners. Oakside wasn't openly hostile. It was just allergic to accountability. What they didn't know was that Miles's badge had been verified, double vetted, and entered into the county database 2 weeks earlier. His clearance was above Stenson's, his training more current, his record spotless. But none of that mattered in a place where perception outranked truth. That Sunday, the O'Neills were invited to a community coffee circle. It was Oakside's version of damage control, a quiet gathering in a cul-de-sac where smiles acted as PR and muffins substituted for hard conversations. Shaq went alone. Miles stayed behind. It wasn't because he didn't want to be seen. It was because he wanted them to sit with Shaq, without distraction, and feel the discomfort they'd been deflecting. The HOA board member leading the event, Helen Truss, introduced herself with the enthusiasm of someone who'd never had her comfort questioned. We're so glad your families joined us. We love a little diversity in Oakside. She beamed. Shaq didn't miss the little tucked into her tone. We're glad to be here, he said evenly. Though I've noticed the welcome gets colder when my son's badge is showing. The table fell quiet. Helen blinked. Oh, I wasn't aware there was a problem. I didn't say there was, Shaq replied. Just said the air shifts when uniforms change color. That silence lasted longer than the coffee stayed hot. By midweek, a new rumor started. This one quieter, more insidious. Miles O'Neill wasn't really a deputy. He was just wearing the badge because of who his father was. A subtle dig. A question whispered behind hedges and passed through passive phrasing. Miles heard it first from a teenager at the local park. My dad says you're just doing this for attention, the boy said. Miles crouched down to the kid's level. You know what real attention looks like? He asked. The boy shrugged. It's when grown-ups go out of their way to make someone with a badge feel like a problem. That's what your dad is doing. But me? I'm just doing my job. The boy didn't respond. But he nodded, just slightly. And Miles walked away, knowing that sometimes it wasn't the adults who listened best. He started documenting every encounter, not for a case, for record. Not just the stops, the tone, the expressions, the just checking in glances that came loaded with implication. One morning, he stood outside the post office in uniform when a woman tapped his arm, middle-aged, tired eyes, holding a grocery bag. I'm sorry about the way people look at you, she said. He didn't respond right away. She fumbled to add, I mean, I know you're official. You're doing a good job. Miles nodded. Appreciate it. But I'm not doing it for approval. She flushed. Of course. I didn't mean. He shook his head gently. You didn't have to say anything, but you did. That matters. She walked away quickly, but her shoulders didn't look as tense. Back home, Shaq and Miles sat on the back deck, watching the sun slide behind rooflines. It was quiet. They think power looks like them, Shaq said finally. Miles exhaled. That's why they don't recognize it when it looks like me. They didn't toast. They didn't celebrate. They just sat in the weight of that truth. Oakside had rules. But Miles had patience. And patience didn't knock. It walked. In uniform. Every day. Without apology. Miles O'Neill stood near the eastern gate. Not in uniform but in his standard off-duty outfit. Black jeans, a simple button-down, and his department-issued jacket unzipped halfway to reveal a soft charcoal shirt underneath. He wasn't assigned here. He was helping had noticed the minor traffic jam forming near the elementary entrance and offered quiet assistance to keep things flowing. His car was parked off to the side, hazard lights blinking rhythmically like a quiet pulse. He wasn't directing traffic, just guiding it. The kind of presence that diffused tension rather than added to it. A few parents recognized him. A nod here, a small wave there. Nothing dramatic, just quiet acknowledgement. Most students didn't look twice. A tall guy helping out was no novelty. Until two squad cars rolled in like thunder on a clear sky. Officers Reed Stenson and Kyle Maddox pulled up fast. Tires kissed the curb harder than necessary. Doors swung open with urgency that didn't match the calm scene. They weren't responding to a call. They were following a hunch. Or worse, feeding a bias. Maddox approached first, his steps sharp, eyes already narrowed. "Hey, step back from the crosswalk." Miles turned, confused for a half-beat. "Morning." There's a minor slowdown. I said step back." Maddox snapped, closing the gap in 2 strides and planting a palm against Miles's chest. The push was firm. Not violent, but intentional. Miles stumbled a half-step, caught off guard by the aggression. Stenson followed close behind, already pulling out a citation pad. "You got ID? You directing traffic without clearance? Who authorized this?" Miles's face didn't change. He didn't scowl, didn't frown, just studied both men like he'd seen this page in the playbook before. "I'm not directing," he said, calmly. "Just assisting." "Where's your ID?" Maddox barked. "You don't just throw on a jacket and walk into school zones like you own them." Miles reached slowly into his pocket, steady as a metronome. His body didn't bristle, his tone didn't spike. But his patience thinned, just enough to register in his pause. Behind them, students had begun to notice. Parents leaned forward in their vehicles. A crossing guard froze halfway through, lifting her paddle. The morning had fractured. Stenson stepped forward. Too fast. And that's when it happened. The slap wasn't loud. It wasn't cinematic. It was sharp, sudden. A reflex cloaked in a mistake. Maddox's hand came across Miles's cheek like an accusation disguised as enforcement. It wasn't premeditated. It was emotional, which in uniform is worse. Gasps scattered like dropped glass. A teacher near the gym entrance dropped her clipboard. A 5th grader whispered, "Did he just hit him?" to no one in particular. Miles's face jerked to the side slightly. His eyes shut once reopened. He didn't move his body, didn't raise his hand, didn't retreat. He just stood. And an emotion that felt like a thundercloud rolling across a summer sky. He slowly reached into the inside lining of his jacket. Out came a leather badge wallet. No theatrics, no raised voice, no hand on a weapon. Just truth in gold and black. He held it up. Said nothing. The badge glinted in the morning sun, like a truth Oakside wasn't prepared for. Deputy Sheriff. County certified. Silence fell. Not awkward. Not confused. Stunned. The block held its breath for 3 full seconds. Time slowed. Sirens didn't blare. Children didn't cry. But every adult in that scene, teacher, parent, pedestrian, knew they had just witnessed the moment where perception slammed headfirst into fact. Maddox stepped back. Not because he was ordered. Because he was suddenly exposed. His expression flickered between confusion and embarrassment. Stenson froze, pad still in hand, mouth parting slightly but not forming words. The phone that had captured the moment was still recording, held by a high schooler who had started filming the second the first shout rang out. Already uploading, already going viral. Miles still hadn't said a word. He slowly closed the badge case, tucked it back into his jacket, and looked at both officers. His eyes didn't shout, they judged. Stenson tried to recover. "We weren't. We didn't. It wasn't clear you were official." Miles nodded once, sharp and final. "Now it is." He turned away. Not with anger. With certainty. Walked back toward his car, where hazard lights still blinked. The message was unspoken, but it rang loud. "I could have embarrassed you, but I won't. You already did that to yourselves." Maddox stood frozen. Stenson exhaled slowly, muttering something under his breath before radioing in a false resolved tag. Within an hour, the footage had hit social media. By noon, it had made the rounds on police reform pages. By evening, an internal affairs inquiry had been quietly opened. The slap was never spoken of in the next day's school email update, but it echoed through Oakside like thunder beneath still water. Because power, when it's silent, doesn't lose strength. It gains ground. The footage landed on Shaquille O'Neal's phone before it ever hit the local news cycle. It came through a private message from someone anonymous. Maybe a teacher, maybe a student, just a file, no caption, no commentary. But the thumbnail told him everything. Miles's jacket, 2 uniforms, the kind of standoff that never ends in a handshake. Shaq sat at the kitchen table, lights low, phone angled, just enough so the screen cast a muted glow across his broad features. He didn't hit play right away. He just stared for a moment, as if giving the file permission to hurt him. Then, no noise filled the room except the soft sounds of morning traffic caught in the background of the video. Then came the barked orders, the unnecessary push, the sudden strike, and the badge, his son's badge. Shaq's jaw didn't clench. His breath didn't spike. He exhaled slowly, pressing 2 fingers to his temple like someone checking for a memory that hadn't fully formed yet. He watched the entire video 3 times, then locked the screen, slid the phone forward across the table like it might burn if held longer. There was a time he might have reacted differently. Raised his voice, called someone high up, walked straight into a press conference, and demanded heads roll. But that was years ago. That was before he learned what his anger cost him, and how little it changed. The louder he got, the easier they ignored the message, and targeted the delivery. Now, he didn't shout. He strategized. In the quiet of that kitchen, he thought back to the signs. The cracks had always been there. Subtle, dismissible, if you weren't trained to listen for them. The HOA had rejected their lawn renovation permit on a technical inconsistency in the blueprint margins. The packages that never arrived, or worse, were returned by mistake after being marked suspicious. The city inspector who showed up unannounced on a Tuesday morning to confirm zoning compliance, though no complaint had been filed. Each instance, he let pass. For peace, for Miles's job, for Shawnee's hope that maybe, just maybe, this town would be different. But this, a slap in public, on camera, to a deputized lawman. His son. No, this wouldn't be quiet. Shaq stood slowly, walked to the back porch where the summer air still held the warmth of the day, and pulled out his old contact book, the digital kind, filled with names few people had access to. He scrolled past agents, producers, past NBA alumni, and sports executives, landed on the name Simeon Livingston, civil rights attorney, nationally respected, and once, 12 years ago, the recipient of a Shaquille O'Neal Foundation grant that built a legal outreach court in a Louisiana neighborhood too forgotten to have one. He hit call. It didn't even ring twice. Big man, Simeon answered, voice crisp, alert. Didn't think I'd hear from you this decade. Shaq didn't chuckle. You'll want to check your inbox. Video just dropped in Oakside. My son, badge. 2 local cops, 1 slap, a beat of silence. Then a low, steady, I'm listening. Shaq laid it out with military precision. Names, times, uniform descriptions. The subtle pattern of hostility before this. The systems that looked like decorum but operated like barbed wire fences. He didn't raise his voice once, but every word carried weight like it had been measured in court. When he hung up, there was no plan. There was a trajectory. Inside, he poured a glass of water, sat down again. This time he opened a different file, one of his own. Notes he'd been keeping for months, HOA memos with coded language, neighbor complaints about unapproved basketball hoop usage, a school letter about Miles being too informal in appearance during visits, harmless on their own, devastating in a pattern. He began organizing them by date. He remembered a day 6 months ago, standing outside with Miles, when a white neighbor's dog defecated on their lawn. The man saw it, saw them, and walked on without a word. Miles had looked at him, curious. You not gonna say anything? Shaq had shaken his head. Not yet. Why? Because dogs bark, but patterns build, and I'm not about to waste a bullet on noise when I'm saving it for structure. He meant that, and this moment was the structure. That night he called Miles into the kitchen. No dramatic entrance. Just 2 men, both 6 feet plus, one tired from learning, one tired from watching the world make his son learn like that. You okay? Shaq asked. I didn't hit back, Miles replied. I know. I didn't even say anything. I know that too. They didn't say much more. But they didn't need to. The house wasn't angry. It was focused. And somewhere on a laptop in another state, Simeon Livingston was already drafting a public statement, not to release just yet, but to prepare. Quiet storms don't announce themselves. But when they come, the foundations shake. The next morning, Oakside still looked the same. Birds chirped. Lawns gleamed. Sprinklers clicked on at the exact scheduled hour. But beneath all that symmetry, something was different. The man who didn't shout had stood up. And that silence? It was about to get very, very loud. The sheriff's department moved swiftly, but not with justice in mind. Within 48 hours of the incident, a brief statement was issued. An internal review had been initiated regarding the altercation between Deputy Miles O'Neill and Officers Reed Stenson and Kyle Maddox. The language was sterile, devoid of accountability. Miles's badge was placed on temporary hold to maintain neutrality during the investigation. The message was clear. The system was circling its wagons, not to protect the truth, but to protect itself. Shaquille O'Neal received the news with a measured calm. He had anticipated resistance, but the swiftness and subtlety of the department's maneuver signaled a deeper rot. This wasn't just about his son. It was about a system that preferred silence over justice. Rather than reacting publicly, Shaq devised a plan. He reached out to the review board, inviting them to his home for a discussion. The invitation was extended with the utmost courtesy, framed as a desire for open dialogue. Simultaneously, he contacted a trusted journalist friend, ensuring the meeting would have an audience beyond the confines of his living room. The day of the meeting, Shaq's home was prepared, not just for guests, but for history. Cameras were discreetly positioned, capturing the gathering without intruding. The review board members arrived, greeted warmly, yet with an undercurrent of tension. Shaq began the meeting, not with accusations, but with stories. He recounted the microaggressions his family had endured since moving to Oakside, permits inexplicably denied, packages consistently misdelivered, and unsolicited home inspections. Each anecdote was a thread, weaving a tapestry of systemic bias. He then presented the video of Miles's encounter, allowing the footage to speak for itself. The room was silent, the gravity of the moment settling over everyone present. Shaq concluded with a simple, powerful statement. This isn't just about a slap. It's about a system that permits such actions without consequence. The footage of the meeting, once released, spread rapidly. Social media platforms were inundated with clips and commentary. The hashtag Justice for Miles trended globally. Public pressure mounted, and the sheriff's department found itself under intense scrutiny. In the days that followed, the department announced a formal investigation into the incident, and Miles's badge was reinstated. But the impact extended beyond Oakside. Communities nationwide began to question their own systems. Inspired by Shaq's strategic stand against injustice, Shaq's approach demonstrated that change doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it emerges from a well-lit room, a candid conversation, and the courage to expose the truth. For the first time in weeks, the HOA newsletter featured a smiling photo of Shaquille O'Neal standing beside his son, Deputy Miles O'Neill, outside the local community center. The caption read, "Proud to support our local heroes." A few days later, Shaq received a fruit basket from the neighborhood welcome committee, the same committee that hadn't returned his calls about garbage pickup delays or the repeated wrong address deliveries. Now suddenly, everyone remembered his name. Miles returned to duty quietly, his badge reinstated after mounting public pressure. There was no apology from the department, no statement from the mayor, just a generic press release about ongoing investigations and appreciation for community patience. But Miles didn't return to prove a point. He came back to watch, to listen, to measure the difference between attention and intention. The calls on patrol changed subtly. A woman flagged him down, asking for help with her car battery, though her engine was fine. A man insisted he saw someone suspicious near the park, and made sure to mention how relieved he was that someone like Miles was on the force. None of them mentioned the incident. None acknowledged the slap. Not directly. They offered smiles stretched too wide, and words dipped in syrup. Sugar-coated surveillance. At home, Shaq had started getting calls from advocacy groups, from sports networks, from podcasts wanting him to speak his truth. He declined most of them. This wasn't a moment for sound bites. It was a moment for stillness. Calculated, careful stillness. Late one evening, Miles opened the mailbox and found a white envelope with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "You're not welcome here, no matter your badge. No signature, no smudges. Clean and direct." He held it for a moment, then walked inside and handed it to Shaq without a word. Shaq read it, nodded once, and pinned it to the fridge with a magnet shaped like a basketball hoop. No reaction, no rant, just acknowledgement. The next morning, an article from a major publication ran under the headline, "Oakside and the Illusion of Integration." It detailed Miles's slap, the town's performance of tolerance, and the quiet retaliation that followed. The journalist didn't sensationalize. She just told the truth, facts laid out like dominoes, waiting. Suddenly, Oakside had a camera problem. News vans parked outside the front gate. Bloggers live-streamed from the sidewalk. A group of suburban moms from 2 towns over marched through Main Street with handmade signs that read, "Silence is compliance." The HOA scrambled. They held an emergency meeting, then sent out another newsletter, this time offering a diversity day, featuring a community cookout and cultural booths. Shaq didn't attend. Neither did Miles. Instead, Miles spent the day walking his beat, keeping his eyes forward while whispers followed behind him. A few kids approached him near the rec center, unsure if they could talk to him. He knelt down, answered questions, gave them high fives, and reminded them that knowing the law was power, even when power didn't always act lawfully. But the pressure was mounting in smaller, more calculated ways. An anonymous call reported Shaq's backyard shed was out of code. The city inspector came, shrugged, and left. Later that week, Miles's cruiser had a flat tire. Nothing unusual, except all 4 lug nuts had been loosened. He didn't report it, just tightened them himself and kept moving. That weekend, a family from the next block over, the Alvarezes, invited Miles and Shaq for dinner. It was genuine. They didn't talk about the badge, or the news, or the HOA. They talked about music, about where to get the best peach cobbler in the county, about how hard it is to grow tomatoes in Oakside soil. It was the first real moment of peace since the slap. Miles laughed. Shaq even cracked a smile. But even peace came with a shadow. When the O'Neills got home that night, their security camera had caught a man walking slowly past their driveway. Hoodie up, head down, holding something in his hands. He didn't stop, didn't turn, just lingered for 10 seconds longer than anyone needed to. They sent the footage to the station. It was logged. Nothing more. The next morning, Miles went to the station early. He stood in the locker room a moment too long, just watching his own reflection in the badge pinned to his uniform. There was no pride in the shine, just pressure. He walked into the briefing room and took a seat near the back. No one spoke to him, but a few gave nods, not of solidarity, but of acknowledgement, like recognizing a rival team that played well last game, respect edged with discomfort. Sergeant Wilkins, the only black supervisor in the department, tapped Miles on the shoulder afterward. "They're gonna pretend like this is progress," he said quietly. "But pretending don't last. Either the mask slips or the man underneath forgets he's wearing it." Miles nodded. "I'm not here for their progress," he replied. "I'm here to remember everything they forget." Back home, Shaq was rearranging a room, turning the old office into something new. On the walls, he started pinning clippings, letters, photos. One wall had a large corkboard, labeled "Watch, Don't Wait." It wasn't revenge. It was record-keeping. Not for the court, for the culture. That evening, Miles sat at the kitchen table, filling out paperwork. He paused, staring at the fridge. The note still sat there, unmoved, unbothered. A warning turned into a monument. He turned to Shaq. "You think they're waiting for us to snap?" Shaq didn't look up from his tea. "They ain't waiting. They're hoping." Big difference. Outside, the air turned heavy with humidity. Thunder threatened but never came. Oakside settled into its silence again, polished, picturesque, and watching from the windows. But the O'Neills weren't the same. They weren't blinking either. The email subject line was simple. "You missed something." Attached was a single video file. No message. No name. Just a timestamp. The same Thursday morning, 5 minutes before the slap that stunned Oakside into silence. It landed in the inbox of journalist Maren Lee, who'd been quietly following the Oakside story after her initial piece on systemic bias in affluent suburbs gained national attention. She clicked the link and leaned back in her chair as the footage loaded. It was shot from the dash of a parked car just outside the school, facing the intersection where Miles had stood, arms calm, directing traffic like any other morning. The view was slightly skewed, but wide enough to catch the arrival of Officers Stenson and Maddox. But it was the audio that cut deeper than any image. From the moment the officers stepped into frame, there was no ambiguity, no excuse. Maddox's voice came through the speaker clearly. "That's him. That's the one they slipped through the cracks." Stenson chuckled. "Wearing plain clothes now, trying to play the part." Then, just before the confrontation, words too quick to be caught on school security. "Let's see if the badge makes you less black." It wasn't just damning. It was defining. This wasn't a mistake. It was a mission. Marin watched the footage twice. On the third viewing, she noticed the teenager's face reflected faintly in the rearview mirror. Steady hands, breath held. A witness hiding in plain sight, recording what Oakside hoped no one would see. She didn't need the sender's name. What mattered was what they risked to tell the truth. Within hours, the footage was in the hands of her editor, and within a day, it was public. The headline read, "Unseen Dashcam Reveals Racial Threats Before Oakside Incident." But it was the clip itself that broke the silence. No commentary, no voiceover, just raw, uninterrupted proof. Oakside responded like clockwork. The town's official site posted a carefully worded statement. "The city of Oakside remains committed to transparency and justice. While new developments are under review, we urge our community to remain calm and respectful as the proper channels conduct their work." But calm wasn't the mood anymore, and respectful had long since worn thin. The footage spread faster than any press release. National commentators replayed the moment on loop. Civil rights groups issued joint statements. A petition calling for a federal investigation reached 50,000 signatures in less than a day. Inside the sheriff's department, panic didn't look like shouting. It looked like silence. Files shuffled behind closed doors. Meetings that weren't on the calendar. Deputy radios buzzed with clipped codes, and eye contact became a scarce currency. Miles was summoned to headquarters, not as a deputy but as a witness. This time, the questioning came from outside. State investigators called in quietly under pressure from the governor's office. The badge didn't shield him, but it didn't weigh him down either. He answered every question without pause, without emotion, his voice steady even as he recounted the moment he was struck in front of children, cameras, and colleagues. They asked if he believed it was racially motivated. He looked each investigator in the eye before replying, "It wasn't belief. It was proof. Now you have it too." That night, Shaq sat at the kitchen counter, arms folded, watching the clip again on his tablet. He didn't flinch. He didn't sigh. He just nodded, slow and deliberate, like a man confirming a truth he'd known long before it made the news. The note on the fridge, "You're not welcome here, no matter your badge," remained untouched. A quiet knock at their door broke the stillness. Miles opened it to find a figure standing in the porch light. A girl, no older than 16, with her hoodie drawn up, and her eyes wide. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I shouldn't be here this late. I know, but I'm the one who sent the video. My brother told me not to, said it wouldn't change anything. But I couldn't just let it stay hidden." Miles stepped out gently, waving her inside. She shook her head. "I don't want anyone to know. I just needed to see that you knew, that you're not alone." He nodded once, his face unreadable, but his silence kind. "You did the right thing." She left without saying her name. Shaq watched her go from the window, eyes narrowing, not in judgment, in memory. He'd seen courage like that before, once in a gym, once in a courtroom, now in a teenager's spine, as she walked back into a town still pretending to blink. The investigation reclassified the incident within 48 hours, no longer a departmental matter, but a potential civil rights violation. The DOJ quietly entered the conversation. One officer, Maddox, filed retirement paperwork and was gone by the end of the week. Stenson was placed on unpaid suspension pending further review. No apologies, no public statements, just exits as quiet as their aggression once was. The mayor issued a new message, this one recorded, not just printed. He stood beside Oakside's seal, the same seal that once stood behind a podium, where Miles was sworn in. The mayor's tone was measured, as if every word had been pre-cleared by counsel. "What happened in our town does not reflect our values." Shaq turned off the television mid-sentence. "Funny how the values show up after the footage," he murmured. But Oakside's machine didn't stop spinning. The HOA sent another newsletter, featuring a full-page ad for Unity Night. There would be music, food, and a badge in community Q&A. Miles's name was listed among the expected panelists, without his knowledge. He didn't attend. Instead, he sat at the outreach office he and Shaq had started across from the park. The mirror on the wall reflected back the same uniform, the same badge. But he felt different now. Not older, not jaded, just more certain. Truth had surfaced. Not all of it. Not yet. But enough to disrupt Oakside's rhythm. That night, Miles and Shaq sat outside the office, beneath the porch light. The air was thick with summer humidity, the kind that made silence feel louder. Shaq broke it first.
"They're gonna keep spinning."
Miles nodded. "Then we'll keep standing." The camera in the corner blinked red, recording, always, because this time, they weren't the ones being watched. They were the ones watching. The building Shaq chose wasn't large, a modest brick-front structure across from Oakside's manicured park, previously used as a seasonal art pop-up that nobody really visited. It had sat quietly for years, barely noticed, tucked between a frozen yogurt shop and a yoga studio with perpetually tinted windows. When the lease went up, no one paid it much attention. And that was exactly why Shaq took it. The sign above the door was simple. Office of Accountability and Youth Outreach. No bold graphics, no sheriff's star, no symbols meant to soothe, just words. Clear, unapologetic. But it wasn't the door that stopped people. It was the mirror mounted just behind the glass. Framed in cedar, it faced outward, catching the eyes of anyone who passed. You didn't just walk into the office, you saw yourself entering it. Inside, Shaq kept the walls clean, the space open. One long table stretched the center, flanked by mismatched chairs gathered from community donations. A whiteboard leaned against the back wall, always half filled with questions, not slogans. There were no uniforms, no salutes, just presence, just truth. Miles ran the first youth workshop quietly, without a flyer or announcement. 5 teenagers came, most by word of mouth. He didn't lecture. He asked them what they knew about traffic stops, about search laws, about what rights looked like in theory, versus what they felt like in a back seat. At first the kids were guarded, half expecting discipline disguised as mentorship. But Miles didn't police the room. He listened. He guided. He made the law human. Week by week the number grew. 10 kids. Then 16. Eventually, folding chairs lined the wall. Some came because they'd been stopped before. Others came because they didn't want to be. But all stayed because Miles didn't speak down. He spoke beside. Parents began appearing, standing in the back during sessions. At first their arms were crossed, eyes scanning like they were still waiting for someone to say something too political. But as the sessions continued, those arms slowly dropped. Some sat, some asked questions. And those questions, once whispered at the back of the room, turned into shared glances. Then nods, not agreement, but recognition. Oakside was listening, not the way it applauded ribbon cuttings or posed for HOA newsletters. This was quieter, slower, but real. One afternoon, a man in his 40s stood just outside the office, arms folded. Miles recognized him. Greg Keller, a longtime Oakside resident, and one of the louder voices during the early days of pushback. He'd once called the news coverage sensationalism, disguised as sympathy. Now he stood staring at the mirror. Miles stepped outside. "You looking for something?" he asked, keeping his tone even. Greg shook his head, eyes never leaving the mirror. "Just didn't expect to see myself like that." Miles didn't respond. He didn't have to. Inside, Shaq was building something different. Not a movement, not a protest, a legacy. He started a small reading group, legal case studies, civil rights history, annotated excerpts from community law manuals. It wasn't flashy, and it wasn't for public consumption. It was for the long game. He invited judges, former defense attorneys, even the occasional journalist, to sit in and talk openly. The doors remained unlocked. There were no sign-in sheets. If you wanted to learn, you came. If you wanted to argue, you were welcomed. But you had to listen to. It didn't sit well with everyone. The Oakside Bulletin Board, a digital space run by longtime residents, began to stir again. "Isn't the sheriff's son politicizing youth?" one post asked. "What's being taught behind those doors?" Another read. There were no threats, just coded concern, dressed up as community vigilant. And then, one night, the silence cracked. It was late, after 10 p.m., when the sound hit. A sharp burst, followed by 3 more. The glass shattered clean, spidering across the sidewalk outside the Office of Accountability. The alarm stayed silent. Shaq had disabled it weeks ago. He didn't want a system that punished teenagers for curiosity after dark. He wanted honesty. But that night, someone used the dark to remind them. Oakside hadn't changed, only cloaked itself better. When Miles arrived, the glass crunched under his boots. No note, no graffiti, just fractured panes and cool wind sneaking in. Shaq stood inside already, arms crossed, the broom leaning against his leg like a forgotten weapon. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. He was just still. Miles moved beside him, scanning the space. Nothing taken. Wasn't a theft, Shaq said, eyes on the mirror. It had fallen face down, unbroken. It was a message. He bent down, lifted the mirror gently, and placed it back on the stand. It faced the street again, unflinching. They didn't call the police. Instead, the next morning, Shaq sent a photo of the broken window to the same community newsletter that once used his and Miles's photo for PR. The caption he wrote was brief. Transparency costs more than glass. We'll be open at noon. The response was mixed. Some replied with support. Others accused him of inviting trouble. But at noon the door opened. Teenagers came. Then parents. Then an old man with a cane who didn't speak, just sat in the back and nodded once at Miles before leaving. The mirror stayed up. The windows were replaced the following week. Same glass, but with a subtle etching in the bottom corner. You can't shatter what reflects truth. Marin Lee, the journalist who'd first published the dashcam footage, visited again to follow up. She didn't bring a camera crew, just a notepad and a chair. She stayed through a full session, said nothing, then quietly handed Shaq a folded page before leaving. On it was the title of her next piece. Legacy isn't earned in silence. It's earned in witness. Oakside kept pretending. The streets remained clean. The smiles returned. But more and more, eyes lingered on the office by the park. Not with suspicion, with thought. The kind of thought that could turn into something more, if given time. Inside, the O'Neills kept building. One conversation, one law, one question at a time. The work was slow. The silence outside was thick. But the mirror never blinked. And neither did they. The chairs were lined in neat, controlled rows. Inside Oakside's Civic Hall, a flag stood in the corner, creased from disuse, while a modest podium waited at the front like a witness about to testify. The air smelled of fresh varnish and old unease. It wasn't the kind of room built for reckoning. It was built for ribbon cuttings and grant announcements. But tonight, it would hold something heavier. Invitations had gone out a week prior. Public Forum on Law Enforcement Oversight, hosted by the city of Oakside. The wording was careful, bordering on corporate, but the subtext rang loud enough. The town had been seen. The footage, the fallout, the silence, all of it now had weight, and that weight demanded an audience. They came in coats and collar shirts, in cardigans and denim, in whispers and stares. City officials sat stiffly in the front row, flanked by department brass. The press formed a cautious wall near the back, cameras ready but hushed. Citizens filled the rest, some tense, some curious, all watching. Miles stood off to the side, behind the curtain separating the hall from the prep room. He wasn't in uniform, but his presence was unmistakable. He'd cut his hair shorter, wore a charcoal jacket, no badge, just a notepad and pen. He wasn't there to be a symbol. He was there to be heard. As himself, not what the headlines had shaped him into. Shaq sat quietly in the front row, hands folded. No entourage, no security, just him. The weight of legacy sat taller than him tonight. The moderator, a neutral voice from the city council, opened the evening. We gather tonight, not to perform outrage, but to examine the systems we've entrusted and the harms we've too often ignored. The room listened, carefully, like the truth might bruise if handled wrong. Testimonies followed. A retired teacher spoke about the tension she'd seen grow in her students since the incident. A business owner detailed how his storefront window became a bulletin board for silent protests. A former officer from another county spoke about the difference between enforcement and empathy. Some voices cracked, others sharpened, but each one landed like a slow drumbeat, steady, sobering. Then it was Miles's turn. He stepped to the podium without paper, without preamble. He scanned the room slowly, not with defiance, but with expectation. He was giving Oakside a chance to stop blinking. I didn't come here tonight as someone looking for an apology, he began. voice level, and I'm not here because I wore a badge. I'm here because I believed in what that badge could mean. He let that sit a moment. Someone coughed in the back. A pen scratched against a notebook. When I stood in front of a school and got slapped in front of students, it wasn't just my face that felt it. It was the law that was tested, not by what I did, but by what I didn't. A murmur rolled through the rows. But Miles held firm. I knew then what I know now, that silence doesn't protect us. It only postpones the truth. And this town's been silent long enough. He stepped down without applause, without the need for it. Next came statements from the department. The sheriff, stiff, rehearsed, acknowledged errors in internal procedure, and a need for cultural sensitivity training. But the real headline came from the deputy chief. Effective immediately, both officers involved in the incident were formally removed, not quietly reassigned. Removed. An independent oversight board would be instated, composed of citizens, legal advocates, and retired law enforcement from neighboring counties. It was progress, not healing, but a hinge. The moderator nodded toward the final speaker. Shaq walked slowly to the podium, not like a man preparing to deliver justice, but like someone choosing his words the way a craftsman chooses tools, with care, with weight. I've watched this town long enough to know its rhythms, he began. Watched it pretend nothing's wrong, then act surprised when something is. I've learned that Oakside doesn't raise its voice, it tightens its grip. He looked toward the front row, where city leaders sat shifting in their seats. My son didn't raise a hand, not because he's weak, but because he knew the law would rise for him, or at least that it should. So tonight, let's ask, did it? Silence answered. He nodded slowly, then continued. I've played games in front of 20,000 people. I've signed shoes, thrown elbows, lifted trophies, but nothing I've done matters more than standing beside my son when the silence got loud. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The room leaned in to hear what stillness sounds like when it finally speaks. You all watched, you all read, you all chose your version of what it meant. But now there's no version left, just facts. And the fact is, what happened to my son didn't start that morning. It started long before that. It started in policies, in fear disguised as concern, in neighborhood watches that never watched themselves. He paused, scanning the crowd. Legacy ain't earned in trophies, it's earned in truth. And truth, real truth, don't flinch. He stepped down. Still no applause, just breath held tight between rows of faces now forced to reckon. Afterward, there were press interviews, brief summaries, some attempted spin, but no one could shift the center anymore. It belonged to the ones who didn't blink. A week passed. Then two. Oakside stayed polished on the surface. Lawns trimmed, flags raised. But something beneath had shifted, and this time the shift was real. One Saturday morning, with no cameras, no press releases, Shaq and Miles walked Main Street together. They didn't wear anything to mark who they were. They didn't stop for photos or handshakes. They just walked. Past the park, past the community center, past the office with the mirror still mounted in the window. A boy on a skateboard stopped, looked up at them, and nodded. Miles nodded back. They weren't protesting. They weren't parading. They were just present. And presence, when earned, doesn't ask permission. The badge had been tested. So had the silence. And both had found their limit. But the watch? The watch had only just begun. What happened in Oakside isn't just a story. It's a lens. If it made you uncomfortable, good. That means you were listening. Now ask yourself, in your town, who's watching the watchers? Because justice doesn't begin when the cameras roll. It begins when someone refuses to look away.
Stay aware. Stay unblinking. Stay part of the watch.